example, in our cohort, we found that children exposed to phthalates in Euro, the boys could say fewer words when they were 2 years of age.
欧州では子どもの発達障害は増えていますか？
But in Denmark, we have up to 15% of all children who are in touch with the hospital or with a psychiatry before the age of 8. And we found that the children who were exposed to high concentrations of these chemicals, they responded more poorly. They had fewer antibodies against the vaccination to protect them. EFSA, the European Food and Drug Agency, and the American Food and Drug Agency have reduced the exposure to these chemicals.
お水を持ち歩くときはペットボトル以外にはどうしたらいいでしょうか？
No, I mean, of course, but we should make sure that it doesn't contain some of these chemicals, the bottled water. Otherwise, you should buy used glass bottles.
皆さんこんばんは。本日はお忙しい中、ダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議の国際市民セミナーへご参加いただきどうもありがとうございます。本日はまず、開会の挨拶の後、講師紹介をさせていただき、40分の講義をお願いしております。通訳が40分入りますので、講義自体で80分かかってしまうんですけれども、その後、質疑応答を通訳の方にご協力をいただいて行う予定です。では、講演会に先立ち、当会代表理事の中下優子からご挨拶とともに講師の紹介をさせていただきます。
はい、皆さんこんばんは。ダイオキシン環境ホルモン対策国民会議の代表理事をしております中下優子です。昨年度の私どもが環境安全基本法という法案の成立に向けての請願署名運動活動を行いました。皆様方には、大変ご協力をいただきまして、おかげさまで、衆議院議長宛て46,336筆、参議院議長宛て47,801筆、合計87,137筆の署名を集めて、国会に提出することができました。皆さんのご協力のおかげで、大変短期間にもかかわらず、これだけの署名が集まったものと、心より感謝いたしております。で、皆さんの頑張りももちろん、非常に、大きな力だったわけですけれども、でも、これだけの短期間で、これだけの署名が集まったということの背景の中には、やっぱり今、子どもさんたちの健康が危ういんではないか、何かマスコミでは報道されないけれども、子どもたちに何か大変なことがひょっとしたら起こってるんではないかというような懸念を抱えておられる、お母さんたち、お父さんたち、がやっぱりたくさんいらしたんではないだろうかというふうに思っております。で、今年のJECA の活動ですけれども、先日総会がございまして、事業計画が承認されました。その事業計画の中心は、環境ホルモン問題ということに焦点を当てて、で、これは皆さんもご承知かと思いますが、EU ではすでに規制が始まっております。日本は、その動きが全くどの省庁にもありません。で、こういうことが続いていると、実は日本の子どもたちが一番他の国に比べて危険な状態に置かれて放置されているんではないかというふうに私たちは懸念するわけであります。子どもの健康安全を守るために、この環境ホルモンについて、まずはどこまで分かったのかということを私たちとして知識を共有していきたいというふうに思っております。で、そこで国民会議では、これから連続国際セミナーを開催したいというふうに考えています。皆さんもご覧になった方がいらっしゃったかと思いますけれども、昨年の11月に、NHK の BS で放送されました。それでもプラスチックは必要ですか？人体を蝕むプラスチックという題する番組が報道されました。で、その中で、いわゆる環境ホルモンの研究者の方々がですね、これは実はプラスチックの中に含まれている物質は環境ホルモンであります。 で、そのことを提起した問題だったわけですけれども、たくさんの研究者の方々が、こんなことが分かってきているということのご報告があり、私たちは驚いてしまいました。こんなに世界では分かってきているんだ。日本では報道されないけれども、世界の最新研究ではもう分かっているんだ。にもかかわらず日本ではみんな知らないままにされている。これは由々しき問題ではないかということで、今回の連続セミナーを企画したわけであります。その第1回目として、番組を見られた方はご存知かと思いますけれども、ティナ・コルイエンセン博士、これがこの BS のドキュメンタリーの中で、研究者としてさまざまな成果が発表されておられました。で、まずこの方をお招きして、いろんなお話を伺いたいという思いで、今回、お招きをさせていただきました。この先生のご経歴を少しご紹介させていただきますと、先生は医師であり、環境疫学者で、南デンマーク大学臨床薬理学、薬学、環境衛生学部の教授でいらっしゃいます。また、国立ハンス・クリスチャン・アンデルセン小児病院でお子さんの診察もされています。生殖と疾病の発生起源に関する分野で175以上の論文を発表されています。特に内分泌かく乱化学物質の胎児への暴露が肥満やメタボリックシンドローム、感染症、生殖異常、成長パターンの変動、アレルギー疾患、ADHD のリスクを上げるなどの有害影響の研究を続けられています。今日は先生からたくさんの有益なお話を伺えることと期待しております。どうぞ最後まで、お聞きくださいますようお願い申し上げます。どうもありがとうございました。
では、講演会について参加者の皆様へお願いがございます。講演資料はチャットで表示されている URL からダウンロードしてください。資料の無断転用はお控えください。本日の講演の動画は後日、国民会議のホームページにアップする予定です。当日の講演の録音、録画、スクリーンショットなどは、スクリーンショットなどでの撮影は固くお断りいたします。講演後に質疑応答の時間を作る予定です。質問はウェビナー画面下の Q&A からお送りください。すべての質問を採用することはできないことがありますことをご了承ください。最後に、ウェビナー終了後にアンケートが表示されます。今後の講演会の改善のためにご協力をお願い申し上げます。では、早速、講演会を開始したいと思います。欧州の最新研究で分かった脳、免疫、生殖への悪影響について、ティナ・コルイエンセン博士にお話をいただきます。では、先生よろしくお願いします。Tina, can you please start your presentation?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to people from all over the world. And that's what these seminars with Zoom and Corona has taught us. And then I'm going to talk to something that's very close to my heart, because that's exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals. And I'm going to give you examples from a child cohort, which I am the research leader of. So I'm going to outline what I'm going to talk about, and you can see the topics here. And it's about how we define endocrine disruptors and my cohort, and some examples of some of the endocrine disrupting chemicals, and some ongoing research and some good and bad news. And what we're going to talk about is what characterizes a hormone. So basically, a characteristic of a hormone is that it is produced somewhere in the body, but it works somewhere else. And then there is more than 50 different hormones and there's neurotransmitters. And I'm going to show you here, just to let you know, I'm not going to go into details, but just to give you an overview of all the hormones. Here, let's take the adrenal gland, the cortisol. It's produced here, but it works all over the body. And we all know if our cortisol is too high, then we get like a moon face, and our skin becomes thin, and we lose our hair, and we get fat all over our abdominal fat. So how these hormone works, this is very complicated, but I'm just briefly, they are sitting on receptors on the cell. And so when they sit on the receptor, then the receptor, the complex goes into the cell and makes the DNA produce proteins. And so these endocrine disrupting chemicals, they work like hormones. They're not hormones, but they mimic the hormones. And there are many different ones, and they're used in all types of different products that we use in our everyday life. And so, for example, we can take the perfluorinated compounds, which I come back to, and the phthalates, which I come back to, but there's also bisphenol A and pesticides and sunscreens. And for example, bisphenol A is what makes plastic hard, whereas phthalates make plastic soft. And for example, bisphenol A, which is hard, makes plastic hard in long chains, carbamide. It's found, for example, in dental fillings or in the inside of cans or in hard plastic bodies. And sunscreens are found in sunscreen lotion, but they're also found in laundry or laundry washing powder to make sure that the colors of the clothes remains. So what we find is basically that exposure to these chemicals during early life, during development in utero or in early life, can affect diseases in whole life. For example, you can have learning of different problems with learning and ADHD and IQ, and that is what can happen in asthma or infections in childhood. And tell you some very specific things about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And these are these 5 things. High doses does not predict low dose effects. The effects are unspecific. There's a long latency from exposure to outcome, and it lasts in generation, and we're exposed to many chemicals, and we're all exposed. So I'm going to give you examples of that. See, this is the example of the low doses that does not predict high dose. And for example, these are mice exposed to a low dose of an endocrine disruptor in utero as fetus. So if these mice are exposed to a high dose in utero, they lose weight because then it's toxic. Because everything is toxic, all chemicals are toxic if you're exposed in high enough doses. Even water can be dangerous in high doses. But if you're exposed to high doses of these chemicals, they lose weight. But if they're exposed to low doses, then they gain weight. And that is a bit scary because normally in research animals, we expose them to a low dose or a high dose, and then we think we predict what the low dose exposure would be, but we cannot know. So maybe these chemicals can cause obesity in low dose, which we don't know because we haven't exposed the animals to low doses. And so as we talked about before with hormones, they have very unspecific effects. So it doesn't mean that if you're exposed to an endocrine disruptor, then you have cancer. You can have all types of diseases because they work in the whole body. And for example, with testosterone, it does not only give you big muscles, it also gives you a clearer brain and a higher blood pressure and more activity. So for example, men with low testosterone, they feel tired and lose energy. But if you give them testosterone, they feel confident and are less depressed. So we talked about this. It's a long latency. You can be exposed in utero, and maybe you don't see the effects until you are middle-aged and you are obese, or maybe in adult life, in reproductive age. So this takes a long time to work. And for example, this is an example of a synthetic estrogen, DES, which was given to pregnant women to reduce nausea. And so this was good for the pregnant women, but then many years later, they found that their daughters had vaginal cancer. So this is an advert showing that it had no effect for the women, but it had an effect on their children, which was not evident till 25 years later. And these children have now been followed, and we have found that their daughters have increased risk of breast cancer and their grandchildren are more infertile. So this just shows that these chemicals has a long latency and affect many different organ systems. And we don't really know how they work, but we know they're not genotoxic. They don't change the gene, but they change the expression of the gene. So, and we talked about the cocktail effect, because we are exposed not to one chemical, but to hundreds and thousands of chemicals. And they might work together and produce a synergistic effect or an antagonistic effect where they work against each other. And we're all exposed. This is just samples of Danish people, young people, pregnant women, puberty children and children. They're all exposed. So now I'm going to talk about my cohort, which is very close to my heart. And my cohort is about 2,550 children and women. And we have a Facebook page. And this is just to show you that we followed the children from when the woman was pregnant until 12 years, and we're planning to follow them till 18 years. And we have measured a lot of things, and we have measured both IQ and ADHD and puberty, infections and BMI and bone. And we can, if you see, we can see that this is children doing all the examinations. It's a lot of work to make sure that they all feel okay and show up for the examinations. So this is just a lot of, the next slides just show all the things we measured. And we have more than 277,000 blood samples and urine sample and hair samples in our freezers, stored in our freezers. So these are all the chemicals we measured in urine and in blood: pesticides and bisphenols and parabens, pesticides, phthalates and perfluorinated compounds. So now I'm going to give you an example of some of these chemicals, which are some of those of most concern for me, the perfluorinated compounds. And these have been produced since the 40s because they have a very, very good properties, because they have water and grease resistance. And they have a long chain of carbon and then fluor here, which makes them very water resistant and grease resistant. For example, use them in pizza trays or in clothing or furniture because they're so water resistant. And the problem with these chemicals is that we are all exposed and they have a very long half-life. So once they're in the body, they stay up the half-life when they're reduced by 50% is almost 4 to 8 years. So they are found in all types of everyday products. For example, in wrapping paper and in muffins or in furniture and in Teflon and in water-resistant clothes for children, and also in running clothes or sports clothes. And most importantly, they are also used in firefighting foam. So for example, when we have fires and we produce this white foam, that's including high amount of these chemicals. So we're exposed through food, water, and dust. And for example, mostly it's food because of the wrapping of food, but it can also be in the drinking water. For example, we have in Denmark an accident where not an accident, but we have an area where people ate cows that they were feeding in a field where they have been fire exhibitions. So there was a lot of firefighters. So these people, they ate the meat from the cows and the cows has been drinking water which was contaminated with this. And so they had very high concentrations, and some of them were children and pregnant women. And I'm sorry, this is in Danish, but it says PFAS can be measured in the blood on almost everybody. We measured in the children and the women, and we can measure it in 99%. So this is how we measured it. This is our equipment. This is a very expensive machine, and it's a very expensive analysis, over $200 per sample to measure PFAS. So in the US, there's been some incidents of pollution in very large areas, and this can be seen in this movie called Dark Waters, which is on Netflix. So this is a movie showing that DuPont, which is a big company producing these chemicals, how they polluted the water in a large area in US. So exposure to these chemicals has been associated with all these outcomes: miscarriage, birth weight, breastfeeding, lipid status, infections, antibodies, and IQ. And for example, the duration of breastfeeding is not so well known, but for example, some studies shows that the women who are exposed to these chemicals, they breastfeed shorter. And that is scary, even though we know that these chemicals are transferred to the fetus and also transferred through breast milk. So the women have lower concentration of these chemicals in the blood than men because they give it to their children and fetuses. So what we did in our cohort was we measured the infections by sending text message to the women every 2 weeks for a year. So actually every 2 weeks they had a text asking whether their child had any infections during the last 2 weeks. And actually we found that these exposure to these chemicals was associated with a higher risk of infections. So the higher exposure to these, the higher risk of having a temperature over 38 degrees if you were exposed to PFAS in pregnancy. And also we found, this is not to be difficult to read, but it was also associated with more hospital admissions. There were more often hospitals with infections to children exposed to these chemicals in Europe. And some studies, this is a study from the Faroe Islands, have found that it also affects the way you respond to childhood vaccinations. For example, these children in the Faroe Islands, they had these chemicals measured, and then we measured the antibodies against vaccinations after they had been vaccinated. And we found that the children who were exposed to high concentrations of these chemicals, they responded more poorly. They had fewer antibodies against the vaccination to protect them than the children who were low exposed to these chemicals. So it actually affects the immune system, probably. And so actually we believe that these chemicals affect the immune system, and also our EFSA, the European Food and Drug Agency, and the American Food and Drug Agency have reduced the exposure to these chemicals, what was the highest exposure could be. So this has made, all the studies we have done has helped reduce the exposure to these chemicals. But just to let you know that we are up against some really big economical interests as well. For example, this is a review study which have reviewed all the literature on the immunological effects of these chemicals. And the study is very thoroughly, they have found all the literature. And they conclude, as you can see here, that there is no clear evidence that these chemicals affect the immune system. And here you can see all the slides that shows, see here. They all have reviewed all the literature, lots of literature. And then if you read the acknowledgement and the declaration of interest, you can see that these people were employed by 3M, which is one of the companies producing these chemicals. So actually, these results are actually non-usable because they are paid by the industry. So I'm going to give you another example of some other big groups of chemicals, and that's the phthalates. And these are found in all soft plastic like toys and food wrapping paper and in the capsules of pills, tablets and water bottles and cosmetics. They're also found in building materials and, for example, in vinyl flooring and in paint. And we're also exposed to those in everyday life, and they can be measured in everybody. And if, for example, they are in a lot of dust from computers and in teenage rooms because it's used in computers. And compared to the perfluorinated compounds, which have a very long half-life, these have a short half-life. So they half-life is a day or two. But we're nevertheless exposed every day, so we can measure them in everybody anyway. And they have been associated with a lot of outcomes as well: neurodevelopment, asthma, obesity, and anogenital distance, puberty, and I'm going to come back to some of those. For example, the anogenital distance, which is the distance from the anus then to the beginning of the genitals. And that is measured routinely in animal studies. So in rats, when they are born, they measure this distance routinely. And it is called, if you're exposed a male rat in utero to phthalates, then this distance becomes shorter. And we call that the male phthalate syndrome, because then the male rat begins to look a little bit more like a female. And because the distance is shorter in female than in male animals. And therefore, we have thought maybe we could measure that distance in humans as well. And so we have done that in many studies, and we have found that if boys exposed to phthalates in utero also had a shorter distance, like in the rats. And also phthalate, this is a review, have been exposed, both bisphenol A and phthalates have consistently been associated with obesity and also with but the effects have been gender and age specific. And for example, in our cohort, we found that children exposed to phthalates in utero, the boys could say fewer words when they were 2 years of age. And is that important? Well, it doesn't matter how many words you can say at age 2, but it does. Because the number of words you can say at age 2 determines or predict how you do in school when you finish school, how well you have your exam papers. And many studies have found that exposure to phthalates, we have also found in our cohort, affects the IQ and the ADHD in children. So I'm going to give you some good news and some bad news. And the good news is always good to start with. And the good news is that actually consumers have a big impact. So if consumers don't buy the hard plastic products, then they are not produced anymore. And also the problem is acknowledged central in the EU and the WHO. So they have measured how much it costs, how much impact they have on the society that these chemicals we exposed to these chemicals. And also we can see that when we regulate and you reduce the use of these chemicals, it has impact because then the exposure level goes down. For example, the Danish government have banned the use of these chemicals in 2 years. So you can't just use, for example, a PFAS. You can't just use another one. It's the combined exposure to all the PFAS that has to be not been used in food and food wrapping paper. And also EU has we hope that EU would follow, but the Danish adventure actually started by a Danish food company which decided a food. These are some of the phthalates measured in young Danish men in 2009, 13, and 17. And you can see that many of the phthalate exposure in urine has gone down. So it works to regulate. But on the other hand, you can see that some of these newer phthalates, they are increasing. So actually some of those phthalates have been replaced or substituted by some others which are increasing. So that's the bad news. I'm sorry, this is Danish, but it just shows that we reduced the exposure to some, but the industry replaced them by some others, which is the chemical structure looks a lot alike. So some exposure to some chemicals decrease, but exposures to others increase. For example, BPA, the bisphenol A, has been reduced, but has been substituted by BPS. So instead of BPA-free bottles, they are just using BPS. And so if you look at the chemical structures, they look a lot alike, but this has been banned, but not this. So actually, we are in favor of using what we call the precautionary principle, which means that if you have a chemical that looks a lot like one that you banned, then you should also ban that. And this is the same with the perfluorinated compounds, the PFOA and PFOS. They have both been reduced considerably, but the industry now uses BPFSX or BPDA, which are similar, but just a different length of carbon atoms. So what we do now is try to follow up the children, and I could talk a lot about that, but you can ask questions, but I'm going to briefly present what we're doing. For example, we are measuring vaccination antibodies towards childhood vaccination at age 18 months and 5 years. And we also measuring, we've measured IQ in the children at age 7 years. And that has been done in the school. So we have a neuropsychologist who had visited the children in their schools. And then we have measured IQ in almost 1,500 children, and that has been done at age 7. But now we are planning to follow up the children at age 12, and that is because we found that IQ was the children's IQ was affected by exposure to these chemicals, but there were sex differences. And for example, some of the chemicals, for example, phthalates, they affected the boys' intelligence more than the girls. And therefore, we decided that at age 12, we would do some more sex-specific tests. For example, some tests where we know, for example, the girls are better at verbal tests. And so and boys are better at technical things where you have for example, computer games or figures that you have to fit. So the tests that we're doing at age 12 are more specific. So for example, some tests of how well they can fit figures into each other. And that's because we want to see whether these sex differences are persisting into puberty. And now the children are going into puberty, so we're also measuring their sex hormones in puberty. And also we're measuring their paracetamol, which is a painkiller, and that has also been shown to have endocrine disrupting abilities. And also we're measuring more of the chemicals in the children. We have measured them in the women when they were pregnant, but we're planning also to measure them in the children at age 7. And at the same time, we know that these chemicals can not only affect puberty and reproduction and neurodevelopment, but maybe also metabolism. And therefore, we're measuring their weight and height and also their cholesterol and lipids. we're also using DEXA scan, and DEXA scan is a scan where you can see how the fat is distributed. So you can see whether the fat is around the stomach or waist, or how much fat there is. It's a very sensitive measure. And so that is why we hope to see whether these chemicals affect their metabolism and gives them diabetes or fat distribution changed. So just to let you know, this is me and my son. And we were in a documentary which was paid by the BBC and the EU and the Danish national television. It was called Why Plastic? And it was about plastic and all the things I've told you about the cohort. And so they followed the cohort and me for a day. And actually they followed me from 10 a.m. till 8 p.m. And I was in the program at around 5 minutes. And this is I was swimming and my son had to get in and out of the car 5 times and it wasn't shown. But I'm showing you the slide just to let you know that in the balcony we're discussing how my exposures when I was pregnant with him could affect his reproduction and fertility. And I think it's important to bear in mind, and that's why I'm showing the slide, that there's a lot of things that you can blame yourself as a pregnant woman, but in the end, he's okay. So in conclusion, I am going to try to go back to the slide about these chemicals because I think that's the most important conclusion. And that's the conclusion about these chemicals that they are we're all exposed to many different of them, and they have a long latency and many unspecific effects, and the low dose does not predict, the high dose does not predict the low dose. So I think these are very important properties of these chemicals that we need to bear in mind. And so I think I could definitely expand some of the other parts. I'm sorry, it's a little bit shorter than noticed, but it's hard to know when you're translating, but I could definitely expand, and questions are welcome.
はい、現在博士どうもありがとうございました。Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
はい、環境ホルモン、内分泌かく乱物質について、その特徴を大変分かりやすくお話をいただきました。また、研究がどんどん進んでいることも、やはりその通りなんだなっていうことがよく分かりました。では、続きまして、皆さんからの質問をお受けしたいと思います。質問は Q&A セッションの Q&A の機能を利用して、書き込んでいただければと思います。では、まず最初なんですけれども、PFAS が及ぼすワクチンの接種の効果について、新型コロナウイルスワクチンを接種した場合の効果に関する研究は世界的に行われているでしょうかというご質問がありました。いかがでしょうか？
That's a very good question. Yes, we have conducted one study showing that there was an effect. The COVID in those admitted to hospital with COVID had higher levels of these chemicals. Of the vaccine, no, I haven't seen any studies on the vaccine. Only on hospital admissions, so that people are more often in hospital when they're exposed. Mm-hmm. So actually, I think it's a very good question, and we are actually examining it now. We are finding the database with all the vaccine and see whether it affects the vaccines, the effect of the vaccine.
では次の質問に移ります。歯科医療従事者の方からです。日本での治療にはたくさんの樹脂やフッ化物が使用されますが、デンマークではどのようになっていますか？
I think it's important to know that fluoride is not the same as perfluorinated compounds. Fluoride is an inorganic compound put in the drinking water because it protects the teeth. Perfluorinated compounds are a long chain carbon. That's a different chemical. But nevertheless, we have also found that fluoride can be toxic for the brain, but that's another story.
では次の質問に移りたいと思います。環境ホルモンは骨密度に影響するのでしょうか？どのような物質が骨密度に影響しますでしょうかということです。
Yes, that's a good question. I think there is not a lot of studies on that, but there is some studies to suggest that PFAS, the perfluorinated compounds, can affect bone density.
では次の質問です。食品ラップには環境ホルモンは含まれていますか？また、電子レンジをかけたときに食品に汚染しませんかということです。
That's a good question. For example, BPA, bisphenol A, was in feeding bottles for babies. And when you heat the milk in the microwave, it was transferred to from the bottle to the milk. But then due to this, then all the pregnant women and mothers, they bought glass bottles instead. So the BPA was taken out of the baby bottles. And in the food wrapping paper, at least in the EU, it has been forbidden to use some of these chemicals in food wrapping because it is transferred to the food, but it is not in all countries. I'm sorry, I don't know if it's the same in Japan.
では次に脳神経科学者の黒田洋一郎さんからのご質問です。日本では環境ホルモン問題は企業側の一方的な宣伝で無視されてきました。その結果、日本では発達障害が増え、がんやアルツハイマー病が激増しています。幼児のコホートで中年、老年期まで延長して調査をしてほしいです。デンマークではアルツハイマー病は増えているのでしょうか？
Oh, that's a very hard question to answer because there probably is, but people also live longer and we are more keen to diagnose than we were 20 years ago, so it's hard to know. But the question about how we're going to follow the children, we definitely are, and that's the problem with these chemicals. It takes so long from exposure to the outcome, but we are definitely hoping to planning to follow the children.
次の質問に移ります。先生は今日、PFAS を取り上げてお話をしてくださいました。数ある環境ホルモンの中で PFAS を取り上げられたのは使用量が多いからということでしょうか、あるいは毒性が強いからということなのでしょうか。なぜ PFAS について、最もご懸念をされているのか、ご説明いただけますでしょうか。
I am concerned of all the substances. I just took the PFAS as the example. And also I am concerned about PFAS because we're all exposed and it's in the drinking water and has such long half-life. I'm also concerned about pesticides, but I didn't have all the time in the world, so I used example from a short and a long half-life chemical.
次の質問に移ります。デンマークや欧州では子どもの発達障害は増えていますか？社会問題化しているのでしょうか？
That's a good question. I think that it has increased, but it's also been, the society are more aware of it. But in Denmark, we have up to 15% of all children who are in touch with the hospital or with a psychiatry before the age of 18 because they have problems. So it is a societal problem, and maybe we have more focus on it, or maybe it's increasing.
では次の質問に移ります。暑い日が続いていますが、具体的にお水を持ち歩くときは、ペットボトル以外にはどうしたらいいでしょうか？
I think some of the plastic bottles are actually okay today. They don't contain phthalates, but some of the bottled water contain the perfluorinated compounds. So, and we don't really know which bottled water because it hasn't been measured in all bottled water. No, I mean, of course, but we should make sure that it doesn't contain some of these chemicals, the bottled water. Otherwise, you should use glass bottles.
先生は先ほど水筒でお水を飲まれていたようなんですけれども、普段から水筒を持ち歩かれているんでしょうか？
Yeah, but we drink water from the tap here because the water here is from groundwater. So that is, our groundwater is actually clear. So I just took it from the tap.
はい。では次の質問に移ります。世代を超えて、環境ホルモンが世代を超えて影響するということについて、もう少しご説明いただけますか？ 内分泌かく乱物質がどこにでもある状況ですので、常に暴露されているために影響が世代を超えて継続されるということでしょうかというご質問です。
I think we all exposed, and that's very important. But the generation impact is the fact that if these chemicals affect the fetus before it's born, then it can actually move on to the next generation. So that if the mother is exposed and she exposed her fetus, and her fetus doesn't get cancer until they're 50 years and they have breast cancer, and maybe also even their grandparents, these women who were exposed to this synthetic estrogen, DES, the impact was not seen until their daughters and grandchildren.
今日のご発表の中で、フタル酸の影響で語彙力が男の子の語彙力が、下がるというような結果がご説明があったんですけれども、そのメカニズムで考えられているメカニズムはあるんでしょうか？
Definitely, because it is an endocrine disrupting chemical. So phthalates is anti-androgenic, so they affect the testosterone level also in the brain, and maybe the boys are more sensitive to that.
はい。また今日の発表の中で、肛門性器間の距離が短くなるという結果についてもご説明をいただきました。これは具体的にどういう問題があることが懸念されるのでしょうか？
That's a good question. I didn't go into that because I was afraid it was too complicated. But anal genital distance is longer in males than in females. And males with shorter distance have poor semen quality and more testicular cancer and more lower testosterone.
はい、ありがとうございます。では、これで、質疑応答を終了したいと思います。イエンセン博士、たくさんの質問にお答えいただき、どうもありがとうございました。
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
はい。今日はどうもありがとうございました。通訳サービスはここで終了となりますので、イエンセン博士にはこちらでご退出いただきたいと思います。どうもありがとうございました。
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
皆様、長時間にわたりご参加いただきましてどうもありがとうございました。最後に代表の中下より閉会のご挨拶を申し上げます。
はい、皆さん、長時間にわたりまして熱心に聞いていただきまして、さらに、非常にたくさんのご質問もいただいてありがとうございました。ジェンセン博士もいろいろとお答えいただきまして、本当に私たちにとっては有意義な学ぶ機会になったのかなというふうに感じております。で、今日のお話の中にもありましたように、もうかなりいろんなことが分かってきていて、そして、規制も始まっている。もちろん一部にとどまっているという部分はあるんですけれども、すでにもうそれは始まっているということが、お話の中にもありました。日本では全くそういった動きすら今ないのが残念ながら現状ですので、私たちもいろんなことをもう少し世界で分かっていることで日本ではなかなかまだ明らかにされていないというか報道されていないといったものについて、知るとともにですね、それをもってやはり、研究成果がこれだけ上がっているのだから、予防原則に基づく規制という話もございましたし、そういった形での、規制をですね、私たちの方でも求めていきたい。規制が非常に効果的であるということがもう強調されておりましたので、そのことをもう一度私たちはよく頭に入れて、行政に対して働きかけを今後も続けていきたいと思っておりますので、まずは勉強会、今年は結構勉強しようと思ってますから、皆さん引き続き連続セミナーを開催したいと思っておりますので、ご参加くださいまして、何かいろいろなアイディアとかございましたら、 私どもの方にお届けいただけたらありがたいなというふうに思っております。どうも本日は最後まで熱心に聞いていただきましてありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。こちらで今回のセミナーを終了とさせていただきます。終了後、アンケートの画面が出ますので、ぜひご協力をお願いいたします。では、どうもありがとうございました。